The first time I realized my brother had not come home out of love, I was standing in my parents' kitchen with a paper grocery bag cutting into my fingers and a stranger's business card sitting on the table between the salt shaker and my father's coffee cup. The card was white, thick, expensive, appraisal services. Under it was a name none of us knew. My father was staring at it like it had been left there by mistake. My mother was at the sink rinsing the same glass over and over. My brother Ethan stood by the window with one hand in his pocket, talking in that soft, careful voice people use when they want to sound reasonable while they are planning something cruel. He said, "I'm just trying to make sure they're taken care of." I remember the way the room looked. The pale blue dish towel hanging off the oven handle, the loaf of rye bread still warm in my grocery bag, the steam lifting from my father's untouched coffee, and that card on the table, small and neat and ugly in a way that had nothing to do with how it looked. I set the bag down on the counter and took out the bread, then the cheese my mother liked, then the apricot jam my father always pretended he did not care about until the jar was open. That is the kind of person I am. I need my hands to be doing something when my heart is trying to break inside my chest. My name is Megan Harper. I'm 37 years old, and this is the story of how I built my parents a lake house so my father could keep living with dignity, and how my younger brother came back just in time to mistake love for leverage. If you are listening from somewhere quiet, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always like knowing where stories land. I did not answer Ethan right away. I looked at my father first. He was sitting in his usual chair by the kitchen table, wearing an old gray flannel shirt with one cuff buttoned and the other left open. His right hand was resting near his coffee cup. It trembled a little when he reached for the handle, just enough that most people would have missed it. I never missed things like that. My father's name is Tom. He spent most of his life building houses, decks, porches, additions. He was the kind of man who could look at a wall and tell you what was behind it. He knew how things held together. Maybe that was why it hurt him so much when his own body stopped doing the same. His knees had gone bad first. Then his heart gave him trouble. Then his balance started changing in ways small enough to ignore one day at a time and impossible to ignore across a year. He never became dramatic about it. He never sat anyone down and announced that life was getting harder. He just got quieter. And quieter is dangerous in families like mine, because the loud people always get mistaken for the needy ones. I am the older child. Ethan is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, he was sunshine in human form if you did not look too closely. Funny, easy, social, good at being forgiven before he was even sorry. Teachers loved him, neighbors loved him. My mother worried about him in that active, visible way mothers worry about sons who ask for things. I was the easier child, the one who handled herself, the one who figured things out, the one people described as steady, which sounds flattering until you realize steady is what families call the person they have quietly decided will survive without being held. Ethan moved away years ago. First Illinois, then Colorado, then Arizona. The jobs changed, the stories changed, the apartments changed, but the distance stayed. He called on birthdays sometimes, sent Christmas gifts late, talked big about visiting more often. He loved us, I think, in the loose and convenient way some people do, enough to mean it in the moment, not enough to build a life around it. I was the one who stayed close. I was the one who knew which step in my parents' old house creaked loudest at night, which cabinet stuck in humid weather, which prescription refill my mother was waiting on, which days my father's knee was bad enough that he needed 2 hands to stand up from the couch. That is not bitterness, it is context. And without context, what happened later sounds simpler than it was. The truth is, the house started with a coffee cup. About 3 years ago, I came by one morning before work and found my father standing alone in the kitchen trying to lift a ceramic mug with both hands. Not because it was heavy. Because his fingers were shaking enough that he did not trust one hand to carry it safely. He saw me notice. That was the worst part. He looked away immediately, embarrassed in a way that made me feel like I had walked in on something private. I did not say a word. I made some excuse about getting going. Then, on my lunch break that same day, I ordered a different mug. Wider handle, textured grip, heavier base. The next week, I brought it over without a speech and made his coffee in that one instead of the old mug. He drank from it. He looked at me once. That was all. My father and I have always loved each other in adjustments, not declarations. A few months after that, I came by after dinner and found my mother leaning against the kitchen counter with both hands pressed flat on the laminate, her eyes closed. She was not crying. She was just standing there in the kind of silence that tells you a person has reached the edge of what they can carry and is pretending they have not. When she saw me, she straightened up too quickly and said, "My back's just bothering me." I looked around the kitchen, then the hall, then the stairs leading to the bedrooms in the old house. I saw everything differently all at once. The narrow bathroom, the slick tub, the stairs my father took one careful step at a time. The way my mother had started hovering without wanting to look like she was hovering. The way my father had started noticing her hovering and hating himself for needing it. That night I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight with my laptop open and a legal pad full of numbers. I first thought about renovating their house, but the more I looked at the structure, the more I understood it would never truly become what they needed. Too many compromises, too many risks dressed up as fixes. So I stopped asking how to change that house. I started asking what kind of house would let my father feel like himself again. That was how the lake house began. My parents had always talked about retiring near water, not in a serious planning way, more like a shared dream they pulled out on hard days. Somewhere quiet, somewhere flat, somewhere my dad could sit outside in the morning and hear water instead of traffic, somewhere my mother could breathe. I had been saving money for years without a real purpose for it, not an extraordinary amount, just disciplined saving, the kind that accumulates when you work too much and do not spend much on yourself. I'm an accountant. Numbers calm me. Planning calms me. So when life became too emotional to hold cleanly in my head, I turned it into columns. Land. Construction. Materials. Accessibility features. Emergency overages. Taxes. Utilities. Insurance. Everything. Then I worked more. For almost 2 years, I took on every extra case I reasonably could. I stayed late. I traveled when they asked. I ate too many takeout dinners at my desk. There were nights I came home so tired I fell asleep in my work clothes on the couch, but I never resented it, because I knew exactly what each hour was buying. A wider doorway, a safer bathroom, no stairs, a kitchen my mother could work in without pain, a path to the water my father could walk without someone holding his elbow. That last part mattered most. The path. Because when I pictured the life I wanted to give him, it was not just comfort, it was autonomy. I did not want him watched all day like fragile glass. I wanted him to wake up in the morning, pour coffee into a cup he could hold, and decide for himself to walk down to the dock. I found the property in northern Michigan. Small lake, quiet road, flat land, enough room for a one-story house and a long gradual path down to the water. The first time I stood there, it was late fall, cold enough that the air burned a little in my throat. The lake was gray and still. I remember putting my hands in my coat pockets and thinking, this feels like peace. I hired a contractor with experience building accessible homes. I sat in his office and told him exactly what I needed. One floor only. Wide doorways. No thresholds to trip over. Walk-in shower with a bench. Grab bars placed where they would actually help, not as some ugly afterthought. Slip-resistant floors. Lower counters in the kitchen. Bright hallway lighting. And outside, a smooth path to the dock with no steep drop and no stairs. When I said the word wheelchair out loud for the first time in reference to my father, my voice caught. I hated that it caught. The contractor did not react. He just wrote it down like any other specification. I appreciated him for that. I did not tell my parents while the house was being built. I wanted it to be a surprise for their 40th anniversary. I wanted one good thing in their lives to arrive fully formed instead of as another slow loss disguised as a practical adjustment. The day I brought them there, my mother thought we were going out for lunch. My father asked twice whether wherever we were going had a lot of walking. I told him no. I kept both hands on the wheel because I was afraid if I looked at him too much, I would ruin the surprise with my face. When we pulled into the driveway, neither of them spoke at first. The house was simple, soft gray siding, white trim, a porch that wrapped just enough to catch evening light, big windows facing the lake, nothing flashy. It looked like the kind of place people in my family would call sensible, which is exactly what I wanted. My father got out slowly and stood looking at it. Then he said, "Whose house is this?" I said, "Yours, if you want it." My mother started crying immediately. My father did not. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped inside. He looked at the wide halls, the open living room, the bathroom with the bench in the shower, the kitchen. Then he walked out the back door and down the path to the dock. Slowly, carefully, on his own. I stood back on the porch and watched him. My mother stood beside me with her hand over her mouth. When he reached the end of the dock, he stopped and looked out at the water for so long that I started crying before I even realized I was doing it. When he finally came back, he took my hand and squeezed it once. That was my father's version of saying everything. They moved in 2 weeks later. The next 6 months were the best I had seen them in years. My mother started smiling more. Real smiles, not just polite ones. She planted herbs by the kitchen window. My father began doing small things around the house again, tightening hinges, organizing drawers, sitting on the porch in the mornings with his coffee. Some days he walked all the way to the dock, some days halfway, but it was his choice. That was the whole point. Then Ethan arrived. No real warning, just a phone call from my dad on a Saturday while I was in the grocery store. He said, "Your brother's here." I stopped walking my cart. I said, "Here where?" He said, "At the house." There was something strange in his voice. Not exactly upset, just unsettled. By the time I got to the lake house, Ethan's rental car was already in the driveway, and he was inside talking too easily, too confidently, as if showing up after years away automatically made him part of the daily rhythm there. At first, he was all concern. He asked my mother if she was getting enough rest. He asked my father whether walking to the dock alone was really safe. He asked if they had thought about being closer to better medical care. He said words like practical and responsible and options. The questions sounded harmless one at a time. But I work with patterns for a living, and patterns matter more than individual lines. Then one morning, my father called and said a man with a clipboard was outside taking pictures of the house. An appraiser. My father did not know why. Neither did my mother. But Ethan did. And by the time I reached the kitchen and saw that business card on the table, I understood something clearly enough that it made my stomach go cold. My brother had not come home because he was scared of losing our parents. He had come home because he saw something worth positioning himself around. I turned and looked at him across the kitchen. He gave me that small, patient smile people use when they think they are the reasonable one in the room. Then he said again, "I'm just trying to make sure they're taken care of." And that was the moment I understood this was not going to be a family visit. It was going to be a fight over who got to define my parents' lives while they were still alive to hear it. I did not argue with Ethan right there in the kitchen. That is probably what he expected. Or maybe hoped for. A loud reaction. Something he could point to later and call emotional. I know that trick because I have watched people use it my whole life. Say something careful and damaging, then wait for the other person to react strongly enough that the original damage gets buried under tone. So I did what I usually do when I need to think clearly. I got quieter. I picked up the business card from the table and turned it over in my hand. Plain white back, no note, no explanation. Then I set it down again and asked, "Did you hire him?" Ethan crossed his arms like he was bracing himself against unfairness. "I made a call," he said. "That's all. I wanted to know what the property was worth." I looked at my father. He was still in his chair, one hand wrapped around the handle of his coffee cup, not drinking. My mother had finally stopped rinsing the glass at the sink, but she still had it in her hand, like she had forgotten why she picked it up in the first place. I said, "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Because somebody should know." That was how he did things. He never started with what he really meant. He started with language that sounded neutral and let everyone else do the work of filling in the uglier parts. I asked, "No for what?" He gave me a tired smile. "Megan, come on. Mom and Dad aren't getting younger. This place is nice, but it's remote. Things happen. Medical emergencies happen. Falls happen. You built this house based on what you thought was best. And I respect that, but we should at least be realistic about what comes next." There it was again. Realistic. I have always hated words that pretend to be kind while doing cruel work. My father finally looked up and said, "Nobody asked him to call anybody." His voice was calm, but I heard the strain in it. My father was not a man who liked conflict. Pain, yes. Hard work, yes. Silence, absolutely. But conflict in his own kitchen with his son standing there and his daughter holding proof that a stranger had been sent to value his house without his knowledge, that was the kind of thing that made him look suddenly older. Ethan turned toward him and softened his face immediately. "Dad, it's not a big deal," he said. "It was just information." I watched my father's hand tighten on the mug. Information. As if that was all. As if people ever gather information in families like mine without also gathering position. I did not say anything else that morning. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had too much, and I wanted the right part of it. I helped my mother with breakfast. I asked my father whether he wanted more coffee. I watched Ethan move around the kitchen like he already belonged in the decision-making center of the room. He opened cabinets without asking. He stood too close to my mother when she was cooking, like he was trying to look useful. He asked my father if he had taken his medication. That one bothered me most. Not because it was wrong to care. Because it was the first time in years he had shown up long enough to know there was a medication schedule at all. After breakfast, I went outside under the excuse of checking the bird feeder by the porch. Really, I just needed air. The lake was flat and gray under a low sky. Late fall had stripped most of the trees already, and the shoreline looked exposed in a way I did not like. The dock sat quiet at the end of the path. My father had walked there almost every morning for months before Ethan arrived. Since Ethan started asking if it was safe, that had changed. That was the part that kept catching in my throat. Not the appraiser, not even the business card. The fact that one man could walk into a house and, with enough careful language, make another man start doubting what he had already proven he could do. A few minutes later, my mother came outside with her cardigan wrapped too tightly around her. She stood beside me without speaking at first. Then she said, "He means well." I looked at her and felt something tired pass through me. "No," I said, "he means something. That's not the same." She flinched a little, not because I had raised my voice, but because she knew I was right and did not want to be. My mother is not weak. I need to say that clearly. She is one of those women who can carry impossible amounts of life without making it visible. But her weakness, if she has one, is that she mistakes peacekeeping for love. She will stand in the middle of something sharp and try to soften every edge until there is nothing left in her own hands but cuts. She looked toward the water and said, "He's your brother." I said, "And Dad is still Dad." She did not answer that. Later that afternoon, I found my father on the porch with his coffee. He was looking at the dock, not going to it. The cup in his hand was the wide one I had bought him years earlier. He always used that one in the mornings. It had become such a normal part of the house that most people would not have noticed it. I noticed everything about it. The way his thumb rested more securely against the textured handle. The small chip near the base from when he knocked it lightly against the sink one spring. The fact that he held it in one hand now more often than two. I sat down beside him and asked, "You okay?" He gave the kind of answer men like him always give. "Fine." I waited. After a while he said, "Your brother thinks I don't know what's happening." That hurt more than if he had said he was angry. I said, "Do you?" He nodded once, still looking at the water. "Enough." That was one of the things people misunderstood about my father. They thought quiet meant unaware. It did not. Quiet just meant he was trying not to shame anyone by naming what he saw too soon. He took a sip of coffee and then said, "He asked me yesterday if I ever get confused out here alone." I felt my shoulders tense. "What did you say?" He gave a dry, humorless little smile. I said not yet. That was my father. Even wounded, he still tried to leave other people a bridge back to decency. I asked, "Has he said anything else?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me enough before he even spoke. Then he said, "He asked if I knew how much upkeep a place like this costs." I looked at him. He looked down into his coffee like maybe the answer to the whole week was in the dark surface of it. Then he said, very quietly, "Megan, I don't want to be discussed like a problem." I could have cried right there. I did not. He did not need tears from me. He needed clarity. So I said, "You won't be. Not while I'm here." He looked at me then, and I could see how tired he was. Not physically. There had always been physical tiredness. This was different. This was the exhaustion of being treated like your own life had become an open question other people were allowed to answer for you. That evening at dinner, Ethan did something small that made the shape of things clearer. My mother had made roast chicken and potatoes. Nothing fancy. The kind of dinner she made when she wanted the house to feel normal, even when it wasn't. My father was halfway through his plate when Ethan said, "Dad, have you and Mom thought about long-term planning?" I set my fork down. My father did not answer immediately. He cut one piece of chicken into two smaller pieces before saying, "What kind of planning?" Ethan took a sip of water and said, "Just the usual stuff. Estate documents, medical authority, property arrangements. If something happened suddenly, it would be good to have things cleaned up." My mother looked at her plate. I watched Ethan's face while he talked. That is one advantage of being the quiet sibling. People forget you are studying them because you are not interrupting. He was not asking out of panic. He was not asking out of love. He was asking the way people ask when they are circling a door and trying every handle. My father said, "We have a will." Ethan nodded. "Sure, but things change. It might make sense to revisit everything now that there's property involved." Property. Not house. Not home. Property. I said, "What exactly are you worried about?" He looked at me, already prepared for that question. "I'm not worried," he said. "I'm trying to be practical. This place is probably the biggest asset Mom and Dad have. That means somebody should be thinking ahead." I said, "Somebody has." He smiled like I was proving his point. That smile made me want to stand up and walk out, so of course I stayed exactly where I was. My mother finally spoke, softly. "We don't need to talk about this at dinner." Ethan leaned back in his chair and lifted both hands a little. "Fine. I'm just saying nobody can avoid these conversations forever." Nobody answered him. After dinner, my father went to the living room. My mother started clearing plates. I helped her, and Ethan stayed at the table looking at his phone. When I passed behind him with the dishes, I saw a line at the top of his screen before he tilted it away. Subject: Follow-up documents. It was open on an email thread. I did not see the rest. I did not need to. Patterns matter more than fragments. That night, I could not sleep. I took the throw blanket from the sofa and sat in the dark living room with only the porch light shining through the windows. I kept thinking about the way Ethan had entered the house. Not like someone returning home, like someone stepping into an opening. And if I am being honest, part of what kept me awake was not just anger. It was shame. Not shame over the house, never that. Shame that some part of me had still wanted Ethan to come home and be moved by it, to understand what it meant. To sit with our father at the end of the dock and finally see what I had seen for years, not decline, not burden, not risk, but a man fighting every day to stay himself in a body that was narrowing around him. Instead, Ethan had looked at the same house and seen leverage. The next morning confirmed it. I came into the kitchen and found a folder on the table. Tan cardstock, bent corner, different from the appraiser's card. But somehow worse, because this was no longer just a business card left behind. This was a packet. Prepared. Intentional. My father was standing by the counter, not sitting. My mother was pouring coffee with unsteady hands. Ethan was nowhere in sight. I asked, "What is that?" My father did not answer right away. He just looked at the folder like it had offended him personally. Then he said, "Your brother brought me some papers." I crossed the room and opened it. Inside were printed pages from an assisted living facility near Phoenix. Monthly rates, amenities, transportation services, meal plans, memory care options. Memory care. I felt heat go through me so fast it almost made me dizzy. I looked up at my father. "Did he give this to you?" He nodded once. "When?" "Last night, after you went upstairs." I said, "What did he say?" My father looked toward the window. He said he wanted me to think about not waiting until there was a crisis. I could barely get air into my lungs evenly. My mother said from behind me, "He thought he was helping." I turned and looked at her. "No," I said again, more quietly this time. "He thought he was preparing." My father sank slowly into the chair by the table, and for the first time in days I saw something on his face that scared me more than hurt or anger. Humiliation. Not because he believed Ethan, because he had been forced to sit there and listen to his own future described to him by someone who had not earned the right. I closed the folder and slid it aside. Then I asked the question I had been trying not to ask. "Has he asked you to sign anything?" My father's eyes lifted to mine. Just for a second. That was enough. And in that second, before he even spoke, I knew this was worse than an appraiser and worse than brochures. It had already moved into paperwork. My father did not answer me right away. He just looked at the folder, then at the window, then down at his hands. That was when I noticed he had not finished buttoning his cuff. One side was still open. It was such a small thing, but it made the whole moment feel sharper somehow. My father was a man who had spent his life fastening things properly: roof lines, cabinet hinges, boat fittings, shirt cuffs. If one side was left undone, it meant his mind had been somewhere else for longer than he wanted anyone to know. I asked again, more quietly, "Has he asked you to sign anything?" This time he nodded. My mother closed her eyes for a second like she already knew what he was going to say and did not want to hear it out loud. I felt my stomach go cold. "What was it?" I asked. My father swallowed. "Power of attorney." The room went still around those words. I remember the sound the coffee maker made behind us, one last soft drip into the pot. I remember the faint hum of the refrigerator. I remember standing there with one hand on the back of a chair because I suddenly needed something solid under my palm. I said, "Did you sign it?" He looked up at me right away then. "No." I exhaled so hard my chest hurt. My mother put the coffee pot down on the counter and turned around. "Tom." There was pain in her voice, but not surprise. That bothered me. It meant some part of her had already sensed how far this was going and had tried not to name it. I pulled out the chair across from my father and sat down. "When did he bring it to you?" "Yesterday afternoon," he said. "When you were outside." I thought about the time I had spent down by the shed checking the stacked firewood while Ethan had stayed behind in the house. That had been the window. He had not wanted a group discussion. He had wanted my father alone. "What did he say?" My father rubbed one hand slowly over the other. "He said it was just smart to get things in place in case there was an emergency. Said if I ever ended up in the hospital again, somebody should already be able to handle things." Somebody. Not Dad. Not Mom. Somebody. I asked, "Did he explain why that somebody needed to be him?" My father gave me a tired look that somehow answered more than words could have. He said, "You already do enough." That line was clever in a way that made me angry all over again. He had wrapped it in something that almost sounded considerate, as if he were protecting me from extra responsibility instead of trying to place himself between my parents and their own choices. I looked at my mother. "Did you know about this?" She hesitated too long. "Mom." Her hand tightened on the counter edge. "He mentioned paperwork," she said quietly. "He said he thought it would be responsible to organize things." "Did you see it?" "No." That was the truth, but not the whole truth. She had known enough to be uneasy, not enough to stop it. That was my mother's pattern in hard moments. She recognized wrongness but hoped kindness would solve it before anyone had to become firm. I turned back to my father. "Where is it?" He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out folded papers. He had been carrying them on him. That made my throat tighten. I unfolded them carefully on the table. Durable power of attorney. Healthcare proxy language. Financial authority language. Blank signature lines waiting at the bottom. And Ethan's name already typed where it mattered. There it was. Clean. Legal looking. Prearranged. Not a vague conversation anymore. Not a careless suggestion over dinner. A document with direction. I read every page twice. That is what I do when fear tries to move faster than thought. I slow down until details begin to line up. The forms were generic but serious enough to be dangerous in the wrong hands. Not drawn by an attorney, from what I could tell. Downloaded somewhere. Printed at home. He had even paper-clipped the pages neatly together. That detail upset me more than it should have. Order can be used to make bad intentions look trustworthy. I asked my father, "Did he bring you a pen too?" He gave one small nod. That was the moment my anger changed shape. Until then, part of me had still been operating inside the idea that Ethan was circling something abstract. Concern, planning, position. But a pen in hand meant he had expected compliance. It meant he had looked at our father and believed there was a version of him tired enough, embarrassed enough, worn down enough, to sign away control because his own son was standing there asking. I folded the pages back up, but I did not hand them back immediately. Instead, I asked, "What did you say to him?" My father leaned back a little. "I said I wanted to think about it." That made sense. My father never fought with force first. He bought himself room. Even now, even hurt, he had reached for dignity before confrontation. I said, "You did the right thing." He looked at me and said something that stayed with me for a long time. He said, "I don't know when asking questions became the same as trying to move me out of my own life." I did not answer right away because I was afraid if I spoke too fast, I would sound emotional instead of precise. And precision mattered now. So I said, "It didn't. He's making it sound that way because he wants an opening." My mother finally sat down too. She looked smaller at that table than she had in months. The lake house had been good for her. It had softened some of the constant tension she carried in her shoulders. Now I could see it all returning. She asked, "What do we do?" It would have been easy to say, "We confront him. We throw him out. We call him exactly what he is." But easy and useful are not the same thing. I looked at the papers again, then at the folder with the assisted living brochures, then at the appraiser's card still sitting near the salt shaker. Not random, not emotional. A sequence. First concern about safety, then concern about remoteness, then property value, then care options, then legal authority. Step by step, he was building a case. Maybe not a good one, maybe not even a coherent one, but enough of one that, if nobody named it clearly, he could keep moving forward inside the fog of family politeness. That was when I understood something important. Arguing with Ethan about his motives would not help. He would deny, soften, redirect, insist he only wanted what was best. People like him always sound most reasonable right before the consequences reach them. No, what mattered was changing the structure around him. I said to my parents, we stop having private conversations with him about paperwork, care, property, or future plans. If he brings anything up, he says it in front of all of us. No one signs anything, no one agrees to anything, and no one explains more than necessary. My mother looked uncertain. Won't that make everything worse? I shook my head. No, it makes everything visible. That is one of the oldest truths I know. Manipulation depends on soft corners. Clarity is bad for it. My father asked, "And if he pushes?" I folded the documents and slid them into my own bag. Then he pushes where I can see him. For the first time that morning, my father looked a little steadier. Not relieved exactly, but less alone. Ethan came into the kitchen 5 minutes later in socks and a quarter-zip sweater like this was any normal family visit. He glanced once at our faces, then at the cleared section of the table where the papers had been. He knew immediately something had shifted. "What's going on?" he asked. I said, "Dad showed me the power of attorney forms." He froze for just a fraction of a second. Most people would not have noticed it. I did. Then his face rearranged itself into mild offense. "It was just a discussion," he said. I stood there with one hand resting on my bag strap, the papers inside it. "No," I said. "A discussion is asking whether someone has documents in place. Handing Dad forms with your name pre-filled is not a discussion." My mother stared at her coffee. My father stared at Ethan. And Ethan looked at me with the expression people use when they think the calm person in the room is being unfair. "You're making this sound worse than it is," I said. "Then explain why you had the forms ready." He gave a humorless little laugh, "Because somebody in this family has to think ahead." That line might have worked on someone who did not do forensic accounting for a living. But intent leaves patterns, and I had enough of them now to stop pretending I did not understand the shape. So I asked, "Did you also think ahead when you called an appraiser without telling Mom and Dad?" His jaw tightened. "That was informational." "And the assisted living brochures?" His eyes flicked briefly toward the folder. "I was researching options." "And the forms?" He lifted one shoulder. "Precaution." I nodded once. Interesting how every precaution seems to give you more authority. That landed. I could see it. He looked at my father instead of me then, which told me where he still thought leverage lived. "Dad, you know I'm not trying to hurt anybody." My father did not answer right away. Then he said, very evenly, "You tried to hand me legal papers in my own house like I wouldn't understand what they were." Silence. Ethan looked genuinely startled for the first time since arriving. Maybe he had assumed my father would keep translating everything into gentler language. Maybe he had mistaken exhaustion for absence. He said, "That's not fair." My father's hand rested flat on the table. I noticed it had stopped shaking for the moment. "What's not fair," he said, "is being talked around." That sentence changed the room. It was not loud. My father never needed loud. But once he said it, my mother looked up. I looked at him. Even Ethan seemed to realize the old role distribution in his head was not holding the way he had expected. I stepped in before the moment could get blurred. "From now on," I said, "there are no more forms, appointments, calls, or research about this house, their care, their property, or their legal documents unless Mom and Dad ask for them directly and all of us know about it." Ethan gave me a sharp look. "You don't get to make rules." I said, "Correct." Dad does. I'm repeating what protects him. He turned back to my father. Is that what you want? My father held his gaze for a long time. Then he said, yes. Again, not loud, but absolute. Ethan looked away first. That should have been enough. In a decent family, it would have been, but by then I no longer believed the matter ended where it was spoken. People do not take that many measured steps toward control and then simply stop because someone says no once. So I did something Ethan did not know I was capable of. I started documenting. Not dramatically. Not like I was building a criminal case. Quietly. Precisely. The way I build anything important. That afternoon, after I drove back home, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down every incident I could remember from the last 3 weeks. Dates. Command. The appraiser. The brochures. The forms. The questions about confusion and safety. The language he used. Who was present. What my father said. What my mother said. I saved the appraiser's card in an envelope. I put the power of attorney papers in a folder. I wrote a summary of the morning while it was still fresh enough to be exact. Then I started checking what I could. The appraiser's company was real. I found the office number in less than 2 minutes. I did not call yet. I just noted it. The assisted living place was real too. Expensive. Good marketing. Near Phoenix, exactly where Ethan now lived. And the power of attorney forms had come from a generic legal download site. Not custom, not thoughtful, just enough to create the appearance of order. That part mattered. It meant this was not Dad working privately with counsel and Ethan getting involved at the family's request. It was Ethan constructing a shortcut. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was uncertain. Because once you finally understand what someone is doing, your body often has to catch up to the knowledge. The next morning, I drove back to the lake house before 8 with coffee and groceries. I did not call ahead. I just went. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was still on from the night before. My father usually turned it off himself in the morning. That morning, he had not. I sat in the car for a second, looking at that light in the pale gray dawn, and understood that whatever happened next would not be small anymore. Because when routines begin to fail in a house like ours, it means the peace inside it is failing first. And I had no intention of letting Ethan turn my parents' home into a waiting room for his decisions. When I walked into the house that morning, Ethan was already dressed. That told me a lot. He was in the kitchen, in a navy sweater, hair still damp from the shower, coffee untouched in front of him. My mother was at the stove scrambling eggs. My father was by the back window, looking out toward the path to the dock but not stepping onto it. The porch light was still on outside, pale and unnecessary in the morning gray. I noticed it immediately. My father always turned it off himself. Small things matter. That is one of the oldest truths I know. I set the grocery bag down and said, "Morning." My mother gave me a tired smile. My father nodded. Ethan said, "You're here early." I looked at him and said, "I wanted to be." Then I walked to the back door, stepped onto the porch, and turned the light off myself. It should have been nothing, just a switch. But when I stepped back inside, my father looked at me with a kind of quiet gratitude that told me he had noticed too. The house felt wrong that morning. Not loud wrong, controlled wrong, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first clear move. It turned out Ethan already had. After breakfast, while my mother was rinsing plates and my father had gone to the bathroom, Ethan said, "I made an appointment this afternoon with a care planning attorney in Traverse City. I think it would be smart if we all sat down and talked through what makes sense." He said it casually, like you say, "You booked a table for lunch." I looked at him for a full second before I spoke. "You did what?" He leaned back against the counter. "I made an appointment. Nobody has to commit to anything. It's just a conversation." There it was again. Conversation, information, options. That whole soft vocabulary people use when they are trying to move something heavy without calling it force. I said, "Did Mom and Dad ask you to do that?" He looked mildly irritated, as if I were being difficult on purpose. They don't have to ask for every single thing. Somebody can just take initiative. My mother stopped moving at the sink. I said, "Not with their legal affairs." He exhaled through his nose and crossed his arms. "This is exactly the problem, Megan. You act like no one else gets to care unless they've earned some kind of permission from you." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in me. "This has nothing to do with me," I said. It has to do with the fact that you keep arranging things around them without their consent. At that point, my father came back into the kitchen, moving slowly but steadily, one hand brushing the wall as he passed. He looked from me to Ethan and knew immediately we were already in it. "What appointment?" he asked. Ethan turned toward him and softened his face so fast it was almost impressive. "Just a meeting to talk through future planning, Dad. Nothing serious." My father stood still. "Can sell it." 2 words, quiet, firm. Ethan's face changed. That was the first time I saw real frustration break through the helpful son mask. It did not explode. It hardened. His jaw set. His eyes went flat in a way I recognized from years ago, back when we were kids and he got caught in a lie but thought he could still talk his way around it. He said, "You don't even know what you're refusing." My father said, "I know enough." Then Ethan made his mistake. He looked at my father and said, "No, you know what Megan tells you." The room went still. My mother turned all the way around from the sink. I put my hand flat on the counter. And my father looked at his son with a kind of disbelief that is worse than anger. That was the line, not the appraiser, not the papers, not the brochures. That line. Because until then, Ethan had been implying weakness. Now he was saying it directly. He was trying to move my father out of authority by suggesting his judgment no longer belonged to him. My father said, very slowly, "Get your coat." Ethan blinked. "What?" "You made an appointment," my father said. "You can call and cancel it. Right now." There was no shouting, no dramatic rise in volume, but my father's voice had that old weight in it, the one I remembered from childhood when he rarely stepped in but always ended things when he did. Ethan laughed once under his breath. "Dad, this is ridiculous." My father did not blink. "Get your coat." My mother looked like she might cry, but she said nothing. For once, she let the moment stand without rushing in to cushion it. Ethan stared at all of us like he could not decide which version of the room he had misread most badly. Then he grabbed his phone off the table and said, "Fine." He walked into the front hall, got his coat, and stepped out onto the porch. I watched through the window as he paced once, phone in hand, shoulders tight. Then he made the call. He came back in 3 minutes later and said, "Cancelled." My father gave one small nod. That could have ended the day. But once someone loses control of a room they thought they understood, they often reach for it harder. That afternoon I was in the laundry room folding towels when I heard my mother's voice from the living room. Not loud, just tense enough that I put the stack down immediately and walked out. Ethan was standing near the front window with an envelope in his hand. My mother was in the armchair. My father was on the sofa. I knew before I even reached them that something new had appeared. "What is it?" I asked. Ethan looked at me and said, "Nothing." That word alone was enough. I held out my hand. "Let me see it." He did not move. My father said, "Give it to her." That surprised Ethan more than anything else had all day. I could see it. He hesitated, then handed me the envelope. Inside was a printout of county property records. The deed. I felt my pulse in my throat before I even unfolded the page all the way, because I knew what he had been checking. And when I saw it, there it was in black and white. The house was legally in my name. Of course it was. I had bought the land. I had financed the construction. I had handled every permit, invoice, and tax filing. My parents knew this in a general sense, but we had never made a family event out of the paperwork. The whole point had been giving them a home, not making them feel like tenants in a gift. Ethan, however, had seen an angle. He said, "I thought Mom and Dad should understand the full situation." I looked up from the printout. "And what situation is that?" He spread one hand like he was presenting simple facts. "That they're living in a house they don't own, that all of this is controlled by you." My mother closed her eyes. My father's face changed in a way that made me want to protect him and stand back at the same time. Hurt, yes, but also insult, because Ethan was not just exposing paperwork. He was trying to rewrite the meaning of the house itself. I said, "They know I bought it." Ethan looked at me sharply. "Knowing you paid for something isn't the same as understanding that you legally control whether they stay in it." I could feel my own heartbeat now, but my voice stayed even. "Is that what you told them?" I told them they deserve clarity. No, he had told them vulnerability. He had taken the most generous act of my adult life and translated it into dependency because that framing served him better. I sat down across from my parents and laid the printout flat on the coffee table. Then I did what I always do when someone is using paperwork to distort reality. I explained it precisely. Yes, I said. The property is in my name. It has been from the beginning because I paid for it from the beginning. That protected construction, financing, taxes, liability, and insurance while it was being built. But I have never once used that fact to control where mom and dad sleep, how they live, or whether they stay here. This house was built for them. That has not changed for 1 second. Ethan opened his mouth, but my father lifted one hand. Wait. So we did. My father looked at the deed on the table for a long time. Then he looked at me. Why didn't you tell us? There was no accusation in it, just a man wanting the cleanest truth. I answered him with the cleanest truth I had, because I didn't want the gift to feel like paperwork, and because if I had put it directly in your name while building it, the financing and liability would have been harder to protect. I thought what mattered was that it was yours to live in, safely, without fear. My mother started crying then, quietly, not out of betrayal, out of recognition. She understood me, maybe not perfectly before, but she did then. My father kept looking at me. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Would you ever take this away from us? I said, never. No hesitation. No qualifiers. No speech. Never. And because truth has a texture to it when it is spoken plainly, the room changed. My father leaned back into the sofa, still tired, still hurt, but steadier than he had been all day. My mother lowered her face into one hand and cried in that silent, shaking way people do when several things become clear at once. Ethan looked from them to me and understood, finally, that the paperwork was not doing what he wanted it to do. So he pushed harder. He said, "That's easy to say now. But if everything is in your name, then all the power is in your hands. You can call it love if you want, but it still means they depend on you." That was the moment I stopped trying to protect him from the full truth of himself. I turned to him and said, "Dependence is when someone uses vulnerability to gain control. You're the only person in this room who tried to do that." He took a step forward. "That's not fair." I stood up. "No, Ethan. What's not fair is trying to convince two aging parents that their home is unsafe, their judgment is weak, and their daughter's love is a threat just because you arrived too late to be central and couldn't stand it." He stared at me. My mother looked up through tears. My father did not move. And the silence after that sentence was so complete I could hear the old clock in the hallway ticking. Ethan said, "You think this is about jealousy?" I said, "I think this is about money, position, and panic. I think you showed up with debt, found a house worth something, realized your name wasn't attached to any of it, and started building a case." His face drained. That was not a guess. I had seen enough by then. The laptop notices, the urgency, the property records, the acceleration. He said too quickly, "You don't know anything about my finances." I held his eyes and said, "Then why did you come here with power of attorney forms before you unpacked your second suitcase?" That landed exactly where I meant it to. My father looked at him. My mother looked at him. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan had nowhere soft to step, no vague language left, no helpful son tone to hide inside. My father stood up slowly from the sofa. It took him a second. I could tell the movement cost him, but once he was standing, he looked taller than he had in days. He said, "You need to leave." My mother made a small sound. Not protest, just grief finally taking shape. Ethan looked at him in disbelief. "Dad?" "No." My father's voice did not rise. It deepened. "You came into my house and talked about my mind, my future, my property, and my body like I was already gone. You do not get to do that and stay here." Ethan looked at my mother then, maybe hoping she would rescue the moment the way she always had when we were young. She didn't. She wiped her face and said, very quietly, "Pack your things." That was the true reversal. Not me speaking. Not the deed. Not even the exposure. It was my parents, together, choosing clarity over his version of care. Ethan stood there for a second like he had not prepared for that possibility, which I do not think he had. Then he turned, walked down the hall, and shut the guest room door harder than necessary. An hour later, he came out with his suitcases. My father was on the porch. My mother was in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug. I stood by the front door. Ethan stopped in front of me and said, "This isn't over." I looked at him and said, "It is here." Then he left. The rental car backed down the driveway. Gravel shifted under the tires. The sound faded. And when it was gone, the whole house went quiet in a different way than before. Not peaceful yet, but honest. My father stood on the porch for a long time after that, looking toward the lake. Then he turned to me and asked, very softly, "Did I really stop turning the light off in the mornings?" I felt something crack inside my chest. "Yes," I said, "a few days ago." He nodded once, absorbing it. Then he said, "I'd like my coffee." So I made it for him in the wide mug, and I carried it out to the porch. He took it in one hand. And that evening, just before sunset, he stood up, walked to the switch by the door, and turned the porch light on himself. Ethan left on a Thursday. The next 3 days felt strange in a way I still do not know how to describe cleanly. The house was quieter, yes, but not immediately peaceful. Peace does not return the second trouble leaves. First, there is the space trouble occupied. Then there is the habit of bracing for it. That was what those first days felt like. Bracing without the event. My mother moved carefully through rooms that did not need carefulness anymore. My father kept looking toward the driveway when headlights passed on the road. I found myself checking my phone too often, expecting some message that would drag the whole thing back open. By Friday night, the messages started. Not from Ethan at first. From relatives. An aunt in Ohio texted. He says things got heated. A cousin I had not spoken to in months sent, "I'm sure everyone meant well." Then my mother's younger sister called and, with that soft, slippery voice some people use when they want to pry while sounding sympathetic, asked whether it was true that I had put your parents in a house under your own name. That told me everything I needed to know. Ethan had already started rewriting the story. In his version, I was controlling. He was concerned. My parents were confused. And the conflict had happened because I was too used to being in charge. I did not defend myself to any of them. That part matters. When people are panicking because the truth is no longer serving them, they start running ahead of it, trying to shape witnesses before witnesses get facts. I have seen it in financial cases for years. When someone senses exposure, they do not always hide. Sometimes they narrate. So I let him narrate. I just did not help him. When my aunt texted again, I wrote back, "Mom and Dad are fine. They know exactly what happened. I'm not discussing it further." When the cousin called, I did not answer. When my mother's sister tried again the next day, my mother took the call herself, listened for about 30 seconds, and then said, "No, you are not going to do this to my daughter," and hung up. That was new. I need to say that plainly. My mother had spent most of my life trying to make every emotional mess smaller before it became a problem. She had often done that at my expense because I was the child most likely to absorb it quietly. Seeing her refuse that old role changed something in me, not because I needed her to fight for me in a dramatic way, just because, for the first time in a long time, she was looking straight at what had happened instead of trimming it into something easier to bear. My father did not talk much that weekend, but on Saturday morning, he put on his shoes before sunrise, poured coffee into the wide mug, and walked to the dock by himself. I watched from the porch and did not follow. He moved slowly, more slowly than before Ethan came, but not fearfully. His shoulders were straighter. When he reached the end of the dock, he sat on the bench there and stayed long enough for the sky to lighten over the water. When he came back, he handed me the empty mug and said, "Good morning." Just that. But in our family, that was restoration. On Monday, I got the first call from Ethan. I let it go to voicemail, then another, then a text. "I think we need to talk like adults." I stared at that message for a long time because it was such a perfect example of him that it almost would have been funny if I had not been so tired. He had tried to corner our father with legal forms, lined up an appraiser, printed care brochures, pulled the deed, and now wanted to imply that adulthood had arrived the moment his control failed. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that night. His voice was tight, but composed. "Megan, this got taken way too far. I was trying to help. You know Dad's health is not good. You know Mom can't manage everything forever. I don't understand why you needed to make me the villain." That line stayed with me. Not because it hurt, because it revealed him so perfectly. He still thought the central injury was to himself, not to Dad, who had been treated like a signature waiting to happen. Not to Mom, who had been pushed into fear inside her own kitchen. Not to me, though that mattered least. To himself. I saved the voicemail. Not because I planned to use it, because by then I had learned not to trust memory alone when someone is working that hard to reshape a story. 2 days later, an attorney called. Not Ethan's attorney, my father's. A local estate attorney from town, an older man named Richard Baines, who had known my parents for years. He said, I wanted to make sure your father reached you. He came in last week and asked me to review his documents and update them. I sat down at my kitchen table when he said that. Not out of fear, out of surprise. My father had not told me. Mr. Baines continued, Your father was very clear, very capable. I just need confirmation on one practical matter before I prepare the final version. That sentence did something inside me I did not expect. Very clear, very capable. I had known that, of course, but after weeks of Ethan pressing on exactly those points, hearing a neutral professional say it aloud felt like a clean window opening in a stuffy room. I asked what the practical matter was. He said my father wanted the lake house protected through a formal life estate arrangement so he and my mother could live there for the rest of their lives with their rights clearly documented, while ownership structure after their deaths followed his wishes precisely. I closed my eyes for a second. That was my father all over, quietly solving the exact problem at the exact level it needed to be solved, without performance and without waiting for anyone else to rescue the situation for him. I drove to the house that evening. My parents were on the porch. My mother had a blanket over her knees. My father had his coffee. The porch light was already on because dusk was coming early by then. I sat down beside him and said, Mr. Baines called me. He looked at the water and said, I figured he might. I waited. After a minute, he said, I don't want any more confusion. I said, okay. He nodded once. Your mother and I stay here as long as we live. On paper. Cleanly. After that, the house is yours. Not because you asked, because I decided. My eyes filled up right away, which I hated a little because my father was never a man who liked being thanked for a decision as if it were a sentimental performance. So I said the truest thing first. You don't have to do that because of Ethan. He turned to me then. I'm not. His voice was calm and exact. I'm doing it because this house exists because of you, and because when I stopped feeling like myself, you built me a place where I still could. There are sentences that divide a life into before and after. That was one of them for me, not because I needed property, not because I needed repayment, but because my father, who had spent a lifetime saying the least necessary number of words, had finally named what I had been trying to do all along. Not manage him, not own him, not save him in a way that erased him. See him. My mother reached over and put her hand over mine. She said, very quietly, We should have seen you sooner than we did. I looked at her. She was crying, but not in that overwhelmed, apologizing to the air way she used to. This was steadier than that, cleaner. She said, You were always the child who looked fine, so we kept assuming you were. I did not say anything right away because I could feel the truth of that in my body going all the way back to childhood. The child who does not demand. The child who handles it. The child who sees everyone. The child who becomes almost invisible inside her own competence. My mother kept going. Your brother made noise when he needed things. You got quiet, and I'm ashamed to tell you how often I mistook that for strength when sometimes it was loneliness. That hurt, and it healed something too. Both can be true. I said, I know. Then after a second I added, I wasn't as fine as I looked. She nodded. I know that now. We sat there a long time after that without speaking. The lake had gone dark except for a thin stripe of last light near the reeds. Somewhere farther down the shoreline, a dog barked once and then stopped. My father took the last sip of his coffee and set the mug down carefully by his chair. That would have been enough for an ending. A clean one, at least. But life does not stop just because a truth has finally been spoken aloud. Ethan called again the next week. This time I answered. Not because I owed him that. Because I wanted the line between us to be clear. He said hello like we were both pretending the previous month had been exaggerated by stress. I did not help him do that. I said, What do you want? He was quiet for a second. Then he said, I heard Dad changed the paperwork. That told me he was still working his channels. Relatives, probably. Maybe someone in town. Information still mattered to him because position still mattered to him. I said, Dad made his own decisions. He exhaled sharply. Of course he did, with your input. There was the old story again. My father as suggestible, me as controlling, Ethan as the only honest interpreter of reality. I said no, with his judgment. He was silent long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, You always wanted to be the one who mattered most. That sentence would have hurt me years earlier. By then, it just made me tired. Because it was so completely upside down. I had not wanted to matter most. I had wanted not to be overlooked. I had wanted my parents safe. I had wanted my father to keep walking toward the water under his own power. I had wanted the quiet labor of love to be enough without becoming a performance. I said, "No, Ethan, I just stayed." He did not answer that. After a moment, he said, more softly, "I was in trouble." There it was. Not apology exactly, not accountability, but closer to truth than he had come before. I asked, "Debt?" Another pause. "Yes." I looked out my own kitchen window at nothing in particular and said, "You could have asked." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You make that sound easy." "It would have been cleaner." He did not deny that. Then he said something that surprised me. "I think I hated that you'd done something I couldn't compete with." I closed my eyes for a second. That was probably the closest I would ever get to honesty from him. I said, "It was never a competition." He said, "Maybe not to you." We did not repair anything on that call. I am not going to lie and make it prettier than it was. There was no dramatic apology, no breakthrough where he suddenly understood everything. But something in his voice had lost its certainty. And sometimes that is the beginning of consequence, not redemption, just consequence. We have not been close since then. We speak on birthdays, on Christmas, when our mother insists. There is a distance between us now that feels less like punishment than fact. Some things survive truth. Some do not. My parents stayed in the house. The paperwork with Mr. Baines was finalized exactly the way my father wanted. A life estate for both of them, clear protections, no ambiguity left hanging around like a family rumor. My father slept better after that, my mother did too. And the routines returned. The porch light at sunset, the basil in the kitchen, my Friday groceries, the wide mug in the morning, the path to the dock. A month after everything settled, my father handed me a folded note. His handwriting had gotten shakier by then, but I could still read it. It said, "You did not take over my life. You made room for it." I still keep that note in my wallet. Not because I need reminding, because some sentences deserve a place close to the body. Now, when I drive out to the lake house, I still pause sometimes before I get out of the car. I look at the porch, the windows, the line of the path running down toward the water. I think about how easy it is for people to misunderstand quiet love if it does not arrive wrapped in speeches. The truth is, I did build my parents a house. But the real gift was not the roof or the walls or even the money. It was dignity. It was making a place where help did not feel like surrender, where my mother did not have to spend every day bracing, where my father could still decide, on good mornings and bad ones, whether he wanted to walk to the end of that dock and sit with his coffee facing the water. And every time I watch him do it, slow and steady and fully himself, I think about how many people confuse control with care. They are not the same. Care makes room. Control takes it. That is the difference my brother never understood. And it is the reason my father is still out there some mornings, one hand around that wide mug, looking over the lake like it still belongs to him. Because it does.